This video was sponsored by Framer. In the next 25 minutes, you're going to learn how to use Rive, and we're going to do it through an interactive button that can actually function on a real website. So create a free Rive account, open up the browser or desktop versions, and you'll be all set to follow along. And by the way, I just released Rive for Motion Designers, which teaches Rive specifically from the perspective of an After Effects user. After Effects experience is not required, but there are lots of similarities between the two apps, and I'm gonna get you up to speed in just over 8 hours of content. There's a link down in the description if you're interested in that. And if you're wondering how you can display your Rive creations on your website once you're done with this tutorial, that's exactly where Framer comes in. Framer is a super powerful no-code website builder that feels a lot like designing in Rive or Figma. You're working visually on a canvas, but the difference is when you're done, it's a real, fully responsive website. They've even got a built-in Rive plugin that lets you drag and drop interactive creations directly onto your page. Whether it's a button like the one we'll make today or an interactive avatar, you can drop it onto your layout, customize how it displays, and even link it up to other pages, all without touching a single line of code. I actually used one of their templates to customize a quick About Me page and dropped my Rive player right onto the canvas without following any guides or tutorials. It was really intuitive to use. So if you're planning to build a portfolio website or promote your work or just show off your interactive designs, Framer is hands down one of the best ways to do it. You can learn more about Framer and try it out for free using the link in the description. And when you use my link, you'll also get 25% off your first 3 months. Thanks to Framer for sponsoring this video. All right, let's jump into Rive and start building that interactive button. Once you're inside Rive, click on the New File button, and we're gonna make an artboard that's a very specific size. But let's just start with the default of 500 by 500, say Create Artboard, and this is gonna be just like a pre-comp inside of After Effects or an artboard inside of Illustrator or Figma. We can change the properties, whatever we have selected over in the inspector on the right side, and there's a hierarchy over on the left that'll display everything that's within our artboard and allow us to reorder things so that their appearance is either on top of or below other objects. Now I'm gonna start by just double clicking on the file name up at the top of the tab here and give it a different name. We're just gonna call this Contact Button and press Enter. Then we're gonna come over to the artboard and I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna double click on that and I'm going to name this Contact Button, and I'm gonna use that format with the lowercase and uppercase, kind of like expressions in After Effects. That's how I like to name my variables. Now, we can change properties of this artboard as if it was a rectangle. So it has a fill color in the background. If I come over to the inspector, I can change this to be white. Perfect. Now I told you we're gonna use a specific size for this artboard, so let's come over to the width and height in the inspector and make it 125 pixels wide by 50 pixels tall. So it's really small now. We're looking at this at 100%, but we can zoom in with Control or Command on a Mac and the scroll wheel, or Control or Command in the plus and minus buttons. We can also zoom to fit on any selection just by selecting something and pressing the F key to frame the selection. This is a little bit zoomed in further than it needs to be though, so I'm just gonna zoom out a little bit. You can pan around with the middle mouse button or holding down spacebar temporarily, just like in After Effects and other Adobe software. Let's add some text. I'm gonna press T on the keyboard to get to the text tool and just click and type out contact. Now I can't see this text because it's white, so I'll click on the selection tool again and then come over to my inspector, and this is where we can change the color. So right here is the color swatch. I just wanna make that 100% black. Now we can see it. Let's change the way that the font looks. I'm gonna choose a font called Archivo, and I'm just gonna type that out. So Archivo, whatever you wanna call it. These are all Google fonts. They're included with Rive. So if you wanna browse them, I'd say go to Google Fonts website so you can get a preview of all of them and then search for it in here. I'm gonna change the weight to be the semi-bold weight, and the size of 20, that's perfect. Now I wanna center this up in the artboard, which I can do very easily at the top of my inspector. Just center this on the horizontal and vertical axes. All right, next let's add a rectangle. So I'm gonna press R on the keyboard to get to my rectangle tool, and then just freehand draw a rectangle out over that text. Now I don't actually want this to be filled, I want it to be an outline. So let's go to our inspector again, and I'll just get rid of that fill. Click the plus button and say stroke. This also should be black, so I'm going to change its color, and the weight of 1 pixel is fine. So there's our box around our text. Let's center that up in the artboard as well. Now I want this to look like a bounding box, so let's add some more rectangles in the corners of this box. I'll zoom in here, press R again, and then click and drag while holding Shift to make a perfect square about 5 by 5 pixels and align that to the center of the line. Let's make that pure black as well. And why don't we round off the corners just by 1 pixel? We're working at a really small resolution, so 1 pixel is plenty. Now let's go ahead and label these objects so we don't get lost. We're gonna call this one corner 1, and we'll call this one bounding, and then duplicate this corner to the other 3 corners. So I'm gonna click on this object, and then hold Alt-Option and click and drag this over to the right side until it snaps to that corner. Shift-click on the first one, again hold Alt-Option, click and drag on the Y-axis and snap it to the bottom. So now I have corners 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's put those midpoint handles at the center of each one of these lines. So again, I'm gonna grab this top left corner and Alt-Option, click and drag this until it snaps to the middle, and we're going to make this a little bit smaller. Let's link the X and Y, or the width and height, and then drop this down to say 3 by 3, and rename it. So let's call this mid left, and I'm gonna drag this up to the top of the hierarchy. Then I'll duplicate that again, Alt-Option, click and drag, and we'll call this mid right. We'll Alt-Option, click and drag it to the top center. So let's find that midpoint right there and then drag it up. And I'll call this mid top. And then one more time, duplicate it down to the bottom. We'll call this mid-bottom. Now, we have a lot of rectangles in our hierarchy and not a lot of structure. So let's first start by just grabbing all of those handles and group them with Controller Command G, and I'm gonna call this handles. And then I'll shift click on the bounding box and we'll group that, Control G or Command G on a Mac, and we'll call this transform box. And then one more time, I'm gonna select the text as well and group these two together and call this contact button. Now you might think that my grouping is done right there, but I'm gonna do one more thing that's just a really good practice inside of Rive, which is create a root group that contains absolutely everything in my artboard. So again, I'm just gonna group this one more time, Controller Command G, and I'm gonna call this root. Now I have this hierarchy that I can expand or collapse at any point, and we can see that all the way up the chain. We've got a group that has everything about the button, but then we also have a root group that just moves absolutely everything. Like I said, that's really good practice, especially once we start adding keyframes to our design, which is exactly what we're going to do next. So we've been working in design mode this whole time, but right over here in the top right, we can switch over to animate mode that opens up this new panel at the base of the screen. This is the state machine. We're gonna come back to that. Take a look at this list over here. We have a timeline 1, and this looks kind of like an After Effects timeline. But we're not gonna use it to actually animate. We're going to be creating states of this button and then transitioning between them using the state machine. And thinking in terms of states is very important inside of Rive when we're creating interactivity, as opposed to working with keyframes and time inside of After Effects. We can still animate that way inside of Rive, but we're not gonna need to for this button interaction. So on this timeline 1, let's just double click this and call it idle. Don't think of these as timelines, think of them as states. So this is our idle state of the button, the way we want our button to look when the user is not interacting with it yet. But that's not enough to save this state. We actually do need to set some keyframes. So let's grab this transform box to start. So let's open up that group, grab the bounding box, and I wanna set keyframes on the width and the height. So now that we're in animate mode, we have this keyframe icon next to almost every property, and we can add those keyframes to our timeline. They now show up down here. We can expand this out. Width and height keyframes now exist on this bounding rectangle path. I also want to set position keyframes on all of the handles. So I'm going to expand that out, shift click on all of the boxes at once, and set an X and Y position keyframe for all of those. And that's it for now. That's what we'll do for our idle state. Now let's right click and say duplicate and rename this timeline hover. So we're going to create a hover state now. What do we want this button to look like when the user hovers their mouse over this button? Well, I want the bounding box to increase in size. So I'm gonna click on that bounding box object and I'm going to just increase the width a little bit. I'm using the up arrow to maybe go to 108, and then I'll go to maybe 34 on the height. So that's how much larger I want that to be. Now I just need to reposition these rectangles to align to that box. So I'm going to hold Controller Command and click on one of these objects. That deep selects into the group that it belongs to and grabs the actual object. Otherwise, it's going to grab the entire group, the highest level of that hierarchy, which is the root group. So Controller Command, click to deep select into that group, and I'm gonna do that for all 3 of these and just click and drag them over to the left. Now, as I move these objects around, they're adding keyframes or modifying existing keyframes, just like After Effects does. So again, Controller Command, while holding Shift to deep select into these objects over here and align them to the left edge. Then we'll do the top 3, move them up to the top, and the bottom 3. We'll grab those 3 and align them to the bottom edge. Now I can click back and forth between these two states and see the difference. Great. Now let's duplicate the idle state one more time, and we'll call this one click, and I'll just move that up in the hierarchy. So we've got idle, hover, and click. And for this, I want the box to shrink a little bit. So again, these are just the idle values. Let's controller command click on that bounding box and make it a little bit smaller. So we'll go down to maybe 94 on the width, and we'll go down to 26 on the height. And again, repeat the process of deep selecting into each one of these rectangles and aligning them to the box. Okay, with just a little bit of manual work, we've got our 3 states: idle, hover, and click. And now we can go into the state machine and actually build some interactivity. Down here is the state machine, and this is where we control what's being displayed in a Rive file, as well as build and control all of the interactions of a Rive file. This big green node that says entry, this is essentially the start of the playback. So it's not playing back in frames, it's playing back as fast as it possibly can. Unlike After Effects, where we're just getting a video file that's a fixed frame rate, Rive is going to play back its animation as fast as your machine or whatever device you're viewing the Rive file on can play back. So that entry point is just the start of the player, and then it's going straight into our idle timeline. We can see that right there. That's showing up over here, the same icon. So if I click play on the state machine, nothing changes because we're looking at the idle default values of our design. But if I were to stop this and change it to a different source, so let's come over to the inspector over here, I could change it to the hover state. And now when I hit play, it's going to show that hover state with the expanded box. So depending on what timeline I set up to be the entry point, that's what's going to be displayed at runtime. If I undo that though and get back to our idle timeline, we can have multiple timelines within our state machine and then create transitions between them. So I'm going to click and drag this idle state over to the left, and then I'll just drag out the hover state as well as the click state. So these are going to kind of snap to align to each other. Don't worry about this any state or exit. We're not going to need them for this lesson. What I want to do though is create a connection between the idle state and the hover state, and we're going to come to the click state in just a little bit. Now we can follow this trail. Think of it kind of like a road with traffic going from the entry state into our first state and our first state into our second state. So now if I click the play button, it's going to end up at the hover state. We can see that highlighted. And the reason for that is because this is basically just a slide right now. We're just instantly going from one point to the other. Nothing is stopping the transition from the first state to the second state, but that's what these little arrows are for. This is where we're going to be able to control the transition and conditions between states. So first of all, let's just set up a stoplight basically that allows us to control when we transition from idle to hover. We're going to do that with what's called an input. So this is very similar to After Effects expression controllers. If I click on this plus button, we have a number, which is like a slider, a Boolean, which is like a checkbox, and a trigger, which is kind of like a layer marker. It's just a point in time, an event that fires off. What we need is the Boolean, so a checkbox control. Now I'm going to rename this is hovering. So if this is checked, that means we're hovering over the box, and if it's unchecked, that means it's not hovering. That hasn't been set up yet, but that's how we're going to treat this checkbox. So now if I select this arrow, down at the bottom, we're going to see this idle to hover transition, and on the right side, we can see that there's a plus button that allows us to add a condition. So if, and then there's a menu, we can choose that input we just created, is hovering, so I'll click on that, and it's defaulted to being set to true. Then we're going to satisfy that condition and allow that transition to play. So let's click the play button on the state machine again, and now we're staying on the idle state because this condition has not been met yet. But as soon as I check on is hovering, then we go to the hover state. Now, if I uncheck this, it doesn't go back because this is a one-way street currently. It's just pointing from one state to the next. We have no way to get back. So we need to build a road that allows us to go back. So let's click and drag off of the hover state and connect it to the idle state. So now we have two transitions, and it's pushed us back to idle because there is no condition for this transition to actually happen. It's just seeing that it's a possibility and heading straight back on that road back the way that it came. So let's set up a condition for this one, but this time I'm going to right click on that transition, go to create condition, and then choose that is hovering input. It's already showing up there. And I can say if is hovering is false, then we go back to idle. So that set up all the logic down here that we needed. It's the opposite of this transition. Instead of true, it's false. So now if I check this on, we go to hover. If I uncheck it, we go back to idle. Great, we've got our first little bit of interactivity, but it's very linear. It's just A and then B. There's no interpolation until we add some interpolation. So select both of these transitions. I'm going to just draw a box around both of them and take a look at the right-hand side. If I scroll down in this inspector and even make this a little bit bigger, there's an interpolation section that looks a whole lot like the flow extension inside of After Effects, and it works almost exactly the same way. Currently we have linear interpolation, so it's just very A to B, nothing fancy. But if we switch this over to cubic, then we have this value style graph that I can click and drag to modify, and I can hold down shift to snap it. So maybe I want to have just a little bit stronger of an ease. If I check this on and off, we're still only seeing A to B. There's no transition happening. So we set up our interpolation, why aren't we seeing any easing? Well, it's because if we scroll up to the top of this section of our inspector, there's this property called duration, and it's set to 0 milliseconds. We're gonna work in milliseconds, not frames in Rive. That's why it's just an instantaneous transition between the two different states. But if I change this to say 250 milliseconds, which would be a quarter of a second, or 1,000 milliseconds in a second. Now if I check this off and back on, it's going to transition using the interpolation I've set over a quarter of a second. Now that might be a little bit slow. Let's change that down to just say 100 milliseconds and see what that looks like. We can interactively adjust this and see it updating without setting any keyframes. We're just changing the interpolation and the duration of the transition. So what if we change this around to where it's coming out much quicker and easing strongly into the incoming state? Now if I check this on and off, it's gonna be a little bit snappier. I think that looks a little bit better. Now, what about this click state? We want to be able to get to it as well. So let's grab this hover state and link it to click, and then do the same thing with click back to hover. Now we're going to need some conditions to get to the click that are different from the conditions to get to hover. So let's select both of these transitions, and again, right click on it, go to create condition, down to new input, and we're going to choose another Boolean. So that will create a Boolean for us, and I'm going to name this one is down, as in the pointer is down on the mouse. Now, since I had both of those selected at the same time, they're both gonna have the true condition in the logic down here, which is fine for the transition going to click. We want is down to be true to satisfy that condition, but on the way back, we need to change that to false. With all of that set up, if I start the state machine again and I check on is hovering, we'll get to hover, and if I check on is down, we'll end up at click. Now, again, there's no duration, so we need to increase that. Let's just increase it up to 100, and let's add some similar easing where we go out of this really quickly and ease into this a little bit more strongly. Now, if I uncheck is down, we're gonna transition smoothly back to hover and check it back on to get to click. So we have the ability to get between all three of our states. We have all the conditions set up for our transitions, but how do we link this up to interaction with the mouse? That's where listeners come into play. So let's expand out the listeners, and I'll just pause my state machine here for a minute. What a listener is going to do is pay attention or listen to things that happen with the user's input. And we're going to need an object for this listener to target or listen to. So I'm just going to grab the contact button group, meaning everything within this will be the target, and then click on the plus button. And since I had that selected, it's going to name the listener the same thing, and it's going to automatically target that object within our listener options. Let's rename this pointer enter, meaning the mouse pointer has entered that object's area in the artboard. And then over here on the right side, it defaults to that type of event, pointer enter, but we can do all kinds of things with the pointer as well as have a click event. Since pointer enter is what we need, I'm going to leave it at that default and duplicate this listener and name it pointer exit. And then we just need to change the event type from pointer enter to pointer exit, meaning the mouse has left that area within the artboard. Now, the reason that we set up these listeners is because down here, again, at the base of the state machine, we can use these listeners to fire off or change the inputs that we have in our scene. So if we change our input selection to is hovering for pointer enter and set that to be true when this pointer enters this area, then it's gonna automatically check that box for us. If I play the state machine and move my mouse onto the box, it checks that box, which fulfills the condition and transitions to the next state. Now, if I move my mouse outside of that box, nothing happens because we haven't set that up with our other listener yet. So let's stop our state machine, go into pointer exit, and again, choose the input of is hovering, and this time set it to false. Now, if I play my state machine, it will enter, check the is hovering checkbox, exit, unchecks the is hovering checkbox, and we can go back and forth as much as we want. Now there's a setting inside of these transitions. If I select them that says allow exit during transition, a lot of times I like to check this on just so that it can transition between states even if the duration of that transition hasn't actually taken place yet. And that's gonna make things a little bit snappier, especially with these hover animations. Now that that's working, let's set up the interactivity for the click transition. Again, come over to our listeners, let's stop our state machine. We still have the contact button selected. I'll click the plus button and we'll name this pointer down. We've automatically targeted the contact button group and we want to change the event type to pointer down. And when that pointer is down, we want to transition or check the is down checkbox. So let's go to that input, say is down, set it to true, and that will fulfill this condition and transition to the click state. To get back to hover, we want to pay attention to when the mouse pointer is let go. So that's the pointer up state. Let's duplicate this, call it pointer up. Our contact button is still the target. We'll change the event type to pointer up. And when that event happens, we want to set the is down checkbox to being false. Now if I play the state machine, move over the button, it's hovering, I click down, it goes to the click, and when I let go, it goes back to hover. That's exactly the interaction that we wanted for this button. Now again, I'm going to select both of these arrows and make sure that allow exit during transition is checked just in case the user gets a little click happy, but I think that's gonna work out just fine. Now something interesting can happen if the user clicks down and then drags their mouse away without letting go of the mouse. You see that is down is still checked. Even if I let go of my mouse now, we're still in the click state. To get around that, we're going to set up one more event with our pointer exit listener. So let's stop our state machine for a second, and under pointer exit, we only have one event happening. Is hovering is set to false. But listeners can control more than one event. So let's click the plus button again, say input change, and also change the is down input to be set to false as well. So when that mouse leaves that bounding box, even if the mouse is being held down, it's going to set that is down checkbox value to false. Let's play our state machine and see if it worked. I'm hovering over, click down, drag out, perfect. That's exactly the behavior that we want. Now, how can we make this a little bit more interesting? Let's go back to our states. Now that all of our transitions and logic is set up in the state machine, we can modify anything about these three states, and all of the interpolation is going to still take place here in the state machine, the same way that we set it up. So let's go back to our idle timeline, and I'm gonna select my text layer. Now over here in my properties for that text, I'm gonna choose this little settings button next to the weight, and I'm gonna set a keyframe on the weight. Since this is a variable font, I can change the weight of the font. And Rive can interpolate between those weights. So with that set, let's go over to hover and make this bolder. Let's say 800 instead of 600. Now that moved the text around because it's left aligned. So I'm gonna just click on that settings button again and jump back to design mode. This is where you're gonna wanna make changes to default settings. And with that text selected, you can see the anchor point is in the top left corner. But if we come over to this origin section of the properties panel, I can change this to 50% on both the X and Y, and now the text is aligned to that anchor point centered. So let's just go back to our align panel and center that up in the box again. And while we're at it, let's also center justify the text, align that to the center, and then go back into animate mode. Now if we go back and forth between idle and hover, we're gonna see that that size change is happening from the center of the box. Perfect. All right, let's go to the click state now, and again, go into our text weight, this settings button right here, and let's drop it down to 400 instead of 600. So we have 3 different font weights now. And if we jump straight back to our state machine and click the play button, we're gonna see that animation interpolating between those 3 different weights, all working together without having to do any additional setup inside of the state machine. It just works. So it's working great. This is definitely a passable button that's very unique and it feels fresh, but we can make this even a little bit more playful very easily. I'm gonna select all of my transitions. So drag a box around the first 2, hold shift and drag a box around these 2, and I'm gonna change the interpolation of all of them to this third option called elastic. And this is going to give us an automatic overshoot between the different states. So if I now move my mouse over, it's gonna have just the slightest bit of elasticity going between the states, but it's really fast because of what we set our duration to. It's 100. I'm gonna set this to 300 just so we can really see the difference now. You see how it's overshooting that a little bit and then doing the same thing when we click down and let go. It's bouncing between those values. I'd like to accentuate that a little bit more. So let's scroll down to our options that we have here. We have the amplitude and the period. If I increase the amplitude, then we're gonna see that a little bit more pronounced. And if I decrease this period, it's going to give us even more overshoot. It's kind of like how many oscillations there are for this animation. So maybe around 0.45, and now it's much more elastic between all of these. The amplitude is probably too much. Let's drop that down to 0.9. And now we've got this bouncy, springy interaction without having to do much work at all. No keyframes required. We're just changing the interpolation between these transitions. I hope this is an eye-opening experience for you, especially coming from an After Effects background. Thinking in states and the interpolation between them is a very different concept than working with just keyframes inside of a timeline. But once you kind of wrap your brain around it, it really becomes a fun and interesting new way to work with motion. If you'd like to see more Rive content on my channel, let me know down in the comments. And if you really want a good understanding of Rive, especially from an After Effects perspective, check out Rive for motion designers. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.